So hello again, and back to Baku here in wonderful Azerbaijan on the Caspian Sea. We're doing our daily methane show, our Buy More Time show here right now, and we've got some wonderful guests to talk about this. And we've already had several episodes. If you've been watching, We Don't Have Time during the week. We've looked at the oil and gas industry, what it needs to do to clean up its act in terms of methane and whether that's possible. We've looked at regulation from the perspective of Nigeria, but also from the EU and others, and we've generally been digging into this as much as we can. But there's a kind of dirty secret about methane, because most people talk about waste and landfill tips, so that's one area where the methane comes from, oil and gas industry, of course, and agriculture. But coal mines are also leaking methane, and they're often not really talked about with quite the same, maybe, urgency as the other sectors that are a bit more common when we discuss the methane story. Today we're going to spotlight coal mine methane. And these are the guests I have to talk about it. Let me first introduce Chris Wright. He's a climate strategy advisor with Ember, which is a really top consultancy. And they have been involved in a couple of really interesting reports on coal methane. We have from London on the magic of Zoom, Dan Barry. He's the CEO of Peak Carbon, and they're a company that actually destroys methane coming out of coal mines, and we want to hear what's happening with his work. And also, by the magic of Zoom, coming from almost the other side of the world, if not the other side of the moon, is Dorothy, who's project manager of the Global Energy Monitor, and they have a section within that which is looking at methane emissions. So I'm going to turn to Chris first. Hi, Chris.
How you doing?
Great to see you. You're a climate strategy advisor at Ember, and I wondered if you could give us a kind of perspective on this whole story of the methane from the coal mines. I think you have some numbers, perhaps, and also just reveal to the audience how much, or how little, but probably how much, of a problem this actually is.
Well, it's a bit of a problem. It depends where you come from, though. If you're a coal mining country, you probably don't think it's a big problem. If you're the rest of us, then you're dealing with it. So what happens with coal mines is that methane gets embedded into the coal underground. As soon as you start digging that hole and start releasing that coal, you're releasing the methane at the same time. This is a process that's not always straightforward, though. In Australia, some of these coal mines are 40 kilometers long. You can run a marathon across them, and they might be similarly wide. So you've got methane coming out over a really, really large space, and it might not be as concentrated as you would get in a gas well, but as you'd also get in an underground mine. And there's still a lot of underground mines around the world. They're doing the biggest share of emissions in terms of methane, but there is a lot of production coming from these open cut mines as well. One of the challenges there is those open cut mines are really hard to measure. It's really hard to get measuring equipment that is cost effective to cover this massive expanse of potential diffusion of methane. And so some of the estimates for that are kind of using guesswork that's really well intentioned, and it's got a lot of complicated models behind it, but it's still guesswork. So when you ask about kind of what's the global figures, every year the UN asks countries to put together inventories and send them in. And right now the UN figure for coal mine methane is about 30 million tons of methane. Now, as your viewers know, methane gets multiplied a couple of times when you're trying to convert it to CO2e.
Yep.
But basically, of the methane, they're at about 30. When you then get independent studies of how much methane there could be, of which GEM does amazing work as well, those numbers range from about 38 to 67 million tons. So about 2x what the nationally reported estimates are. And that creates a massive amount of uncertainty. Now, if we're at that 67 million ton range, maybe the intention to deal with it would be greater. When we're at that 30 million ton range, and a big chunk of that comes from China as well as other coal mining countries, there's less of that push, I guess. So getting that measurement right is really important, and because so much of the world's coal mines are these big surface mines, there's not a lot of confidence in some of that measurement accuracy.
Right. So we're in uncertainty. There's clearly a significant amount of methane coming out. And if we care about the Paris Agreement targets, about halving emissions by 2030, then coal mine methane needs to be included, but we need to have a good handle on this.
Absolutely.
So that governments can act and the private sector can act to actually do it, hopefully because they want to do it, rather than they're completely tied and bound up and dragged off to do it. So, okay, let's just stay with us because we can go further with this. Dorothy, you're coming in from the west coast of the United States, where it must be very early in the morning. So thank you so much for being awake. And tell us a little bit about the Global Energy Monitor in terms of methane. What kind of things are you finding from your research?
Sure. So currently my work at GEM mainly involves in the Global Coal Mine Tracker. It's a project we collect, analyze, and publish open source data on coal mines, including the estimates of methane emissions from both active mines, as well as some proposed mine projects. So coal mine methane, from in our current group estimates for coal mine methane is mainly for from ex exists much higher than the estimates from the IEA. This is mainly because of the the differences of methodology we're using, and like calculating and estimating the methane emissions from individual mines just very complex. Just it's a very complex process because methane emissions can vary widely. Due to different, depending on different factors like gas content, mine depth, and coal types, production volume. As Chris has just mentioned, that China is the single largest methane emitters in the world, mainly because it has so many underground type of mines, and the production volume is just incomparable. And so generally, like deeper mines hold more methane because of underground pressure, and underground mines release more methane than surface mines. And in our calculation, the underground 80% of over 90% of the methane emissions are from the underground mines. And surface mines, they do release methane, but it's compared with the underground mines, it's just very small. However, as more and more large scale surface mines are developed, under development, it is we estimate that the scale of the methane emission from those large underground mines will increase accordingly. Yeah,
Okay.
so this is just about coal mine methane from the operating mines, and the abandoned mines is another thing that we are trying to track. In our coal mine tracker, but we haven't had any estimates on those, mainly because of the lack of the global data. So it's like when active coal mines still remains the primary focus in terms of the mitigation efforts, but abandoned coal mines could be another concern in the long run, but it's largely under recognized still. And just yeah.
I think that's good, Dorothy. Yeah, I mean, orphan coal mines obviously are an issue too, as you rightly point out, a bit like orphaned oil and gas wells. Again, they don't really get that much attention. A bit like currently coal mining, methane doesn't get as much attention, perhaps, in these kind of international conferences. So, I mean, probably what I would say, I mean, to all three before I introduce our next wonderful guest is, I suppose, many people hold the position that we shouldn't be coal mining at all if we want to save the world from climate change. But if we are going to still have mines operating, hopefully on a decreasing number in the world, so we can actually achieve the goals of keeping a safe climate safe world, we might as well also do something with the methane. And obviously when they do get abandoned, the methane has to be handled as well in a sensible way, so it doesn't cause more problems than whatever. So, good points. Okay, so let's just go over to our next guest, which is Dan Barry, who's the CEO of Peak Carbon. You're based in London, Dan, and one of your jobs is to basically destroy methane coming from coal mines, right? So that it's less polluting and less of a climate problem. How is that going? Is there any interest in destroying methane coming from coal mines?
Yes, absolutely. So your colleague makes a very valid point, which is this is all about buying time as the world sort of solves its addiction to different types of coal for different use cases. There's a lot we can do in the interim, which is reduce the methane, which has such short-term global warming impact. And thankfully, there are technologies that have been around since the early 80s called regenerative thermal oxidizers, which you can quite easily deploy at least underground coal mines on the surface, capture the methane that is coming out of these coal mines and oxidize it. You convert the methane into CO2. So unfortunately, there is still CO2 going up into the atmosphere, but that's an awful lot better than methane going up into the atmosphere. By some estimates, as much as 100 times less damaging over a very short term in terms of radiative forces. So the other advantage is this is one of the lowest cost abatement options that probably almost most countries have available to them. These projects tend to be able to be financeable at carbon prices in the order of 20 to 30 US dollars per ton, perhaps even lower for very, very dirty mines. Obviously, the higher the concentration of methane coming out, the more carbon dioxide equivalent you're saving by implementing this technology. But the key thing is there is no revenue stream from this project other than the incentive that a carbon pricing regime puts upon that project. So in countries like Australia, where we have now got the safeguard mechanism, or in the US, where we have the Western Climate Initiative, there is a carbon price in effect that means whether it's the coal mines or third parties that are implementing the projects for the coal mines, they are now incentivized by either saving money against their liability under the carbon price or making money by creating some sort of carbon credit to implement these projects.
Right.
Whereas jurisdictions which have no carbon pricing, there is no power generation or some other revenue stream that makes these projects economically viable. You need a carbon price to make these projects happen.
And Dan, just briefly, why can't you can the coal mines like they can do with the oil and gas industry and have a revenue stream?
So the key thing is when you mine, as Dorothy alluded to, the coal seam is full of gas, and when you mine the seam, you can hear the gas hissing out. In an enclosed space, if that gas reaches 5% or above concentration, it becomes explosive. So that's when you have horrible coal mining accidents. So one of the key safety features, if you blow large volumes of air through the mine shaft and keep the methane diluted to 1% or below, ideally. And of course, at those concentrations, it's too low to capture it or utilize it for anything particular. If you're looking to generate power, you tend to be up in like the 40 to 50% concentrations or potentially even higher if you want to concentrate it into something like compressed natural or some sort of use case.
Okay. Good. That explains that for the audience. So let's just have a look. We've got about 15 minutes left. Let's just try and dig into this a bit. So here at the COP in COP29 in Baku, there is some movement on coal mines. I mean, it's not just here, but in the run-up to it as well. So we've got the US and China working together on all the super pollutants. And I see that it's not that long ago, and it was reiterated again here by the Chinese delegation that indeed act on the methane coming from their coal mines. So that's positive. Obviously, Australia, as Dan was referring to, have a price on methane, so that there's a chance to actually have a revenue stream, so that it encourages companies to come in and destroy the methane. Is there any other action elsewhere in the world that we can see? I see the EU. Actually, I had the EU on the stage yesterday, I think it was. They say coal mines are covered in the for methane in the EU. So could it be that all these methane regulations that are now coming around the world, Nigeria's got some, I think Kazakhstan is soon getting them, blah, 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 could incorporate coal mine methane in? Would that be a good start?
That would be a great start, and that's already happening in many places. So the
Right.
EU methane regulations have coal mines front and center, thermal coal mines at least. The Polish asked for the metallurgical coal mines to have a nice little exclusion there, but thermal coal mines are front and center of that regulation, and that ties in with the CBAM effect as well. So that's going to impact future imports into Europe, of which Australia is a big importer as well.
Right.
So those trade regulations can have a big role there. The safeguard mechanism in Australia has a big role. It's not a methane focus per se, it's CO2e across the economy.
So carbon dioxide equivalent,
Yep.
so you have to multiply, but yeah, I understand.
And for a coal mine, for an underground coal mine in particular, methane's a big problem there. So that type of mechanism can have an indirect, really big incentive push on those type of mines. And you've also got private sector kind of companies taking the lead. Anglo American in Australia was doing a massive amount of methane utilization from its mines, where it was getting the methane out of the mines before they started doing the mining, before kind of what Neil was saying, his technology needs to come in and take care of the methane that's coming out during the mining. So there is a lot of progress there. The problem is it doesn't have that kind of front line of regulations that's really driving it forward. And the coal mining sector is making a lot of money with the way things are. And as Neil highlighted, if they had to kind of start dealing... Dan, sorry.
It's all right. His mate's called Neil.
Yeah,
so
no,
that's,
I've probably spent too long with his mate. But as Dan highlighted, if you don't have that incentive structure and that regulatory push, we haven't seen a track record of enough companies stepping up and saying, we want to go ahead and do this. And that's private sector companies or publicly owned entities. Though, in a place like China, you can have that opportunity of really good regulations transforming the entire industry.
yeah. And I think that, just briefly, I mean, I think when the EU, the chap who was here from the EU was saying that the initial thing with their methane regulations on everything, not just coal mine methane emissions, is that they would like to encourage people to adopt higher standards and remove the methane before the coal is shipped, as it were. But that over time there will be some sticks coming if people don't play by the rules. I'm going to come to you in 2 seconds, Dan. I just want to go back to Dorothy, just to say, so I understand the uncertainties of the methane coming from the coal mines, both operating and orphaned or abandoned. But don't you think with, I mean, we had Al Gore here speaking last night, and actually we got a big, I think it's either tonight or tomorrow we're going to give his full speech, something called Carbon Tracer that they've developed, which can spot emissions of loads of greenhouse gases in ways one could never dream of. I suppose also supplemented by the new methane satellite. There's a European Union satellite, I think, and there are legions of NGOs and stuff with handheld sensors. So do you think with the new monitoring that's coming through that we might get a better handle on what exactly is going on with methane from coal mines?
Absolutely. I think the advancement in the satellite and remote sensing technology could definitely help us get better understanding of the scale of the methane problem, and also improve our ability to estimate the methane emissions regionally over time. This is a really exciting development. However, I think we are still at an infant stage, and the target measurement campaigns have been mainly concentrated in some countries, in certain countries like the US and, the European countries, where, methane data is more comprehensive. But for some other countries, like the really large emitters like China, Russia, India, they have far less reliable, data, and which could add uncertainty still, to their actual emission levels.
So
Yeah.
we need to urge those countries to move quickly to get a better handle on
Exactly.
their emissions and report more honest emissions into the UN process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We also have a tracker called Global Methane Emitter Tracker. So we're trying to add we're trying to add the plume data, that we tracked from using, so for example, through the carbon mapper, and the coal mine methane polluter. Sorry, the plume data of coal mine methane, it's just very, very limited. And yeah, compared with the oil and gas sector, the coal mine methane plume data is very small.
Okay. Great. Okay, then back to you, Dan. Yeah.
I just want to sort of reflect on your comment, which, we talked about a little bit of green shoots about, methane regulation, but I would say my observations, it still gets such a free pass globally. The EU ETS really only covers CO2 emissions. The UK ETS only really covers CO2 emissions. The Western Climate Initiative only covers CO2 emissions. Australia is pretty much the only major regime I can think of that includes methane as one of its covered gases. The Chinese ETS, I believe, is CO2 only. You are starting to have some direct methane regulation that's being imposed, as you alluded to, in the EU. But the problem when you go down the command and control route rather than sort of the incentive mechanisms is more often than not, sometimes the criteria or benchmarks that end up getting negotiated between industries have plenty of wiggle room such that actually, it takes quite a long time before these things actually bite. And I could see Chris chuckling to himself there because he knows exactly what I'm talking about. And when methane is such an immediate issue, like it is it is 100 times more damaging over like a 10-year period or 20-year period, slightly less, that, why take routes which take, 5 years before they start to bite? Why not just start chucking this in with the existing regulatory infrastructure we have and start creating the incentives, not just sticks, like you say, but carrots for coal mines to go after some of this stuff and make good business out of something environmental.
But don't you think it's possible, I don't mean today, but maybe in 3 or 4 years' time, that if the companies, I mean, in the coal sector, but also the oil and gas sector, aren't actually provably reducing their methane emissions, that something like the EU could start bringing in penalties against countries or companies wanting to ship coal that is not methane abated? In other words, wouldn't that provide some economic incentive for them to destroy that methane in those coal mines if they feel their product cannot be sold? Or maybe the EU market's too small for that to really matter. I don't know. This gets into markets and economics. But do you think regulation could, if it has some teeth, have an impact? Or should it have teeth and be backed up by a proper emissions trading scheme?
So my point of view is that often when you introduce these teeth-like mechanisms, which are, like I call, more command and control type mechanisms, they tend to, because they are so sort of definitive, they tend to have a slightly longer phase-in times. And be also a little bit more room on the criteria of what's good, deemed sort of good and bad. Whereas if you introduce stuff into market-based mechanisms, actually you make it much more incentive-based than necessarily penalty-based. That some of these coal mines, are sitting on, they could turn methane abatement into something valuable for the coal mine. And I know vilify and make a large good environmental benefit impact. Why is that necessarily such a bad thing?
Okay, we can't solve the whole problem today. We're obviously close. There's 3 clever people there and me as the moderator, but we can't fully solve it today. We literally got 1 minute left. So your call, Dan, would be for governments to bring in carbon markets that reflect methane in their economies. Okay. Dorothy, you think that there needs to be obviously stepped up monitoring, that you feel that the new systems might be useful, but they might not be the full banana, that we might need something else to get it right. And Chris, you started. Any last point that you want to make?
Well, one of the opportunities, like Neil's talking about, is that it might not happen today.
Dan.
But
Let's cancel the whole show. We'll start again.
you can install this stuff, get it running, destroying methane within maybe 18 months.
Yeah.
So if you did get those incentives right, if you did get those regulations right, you could start destroying that methane maybe by next year's COP.
Yeah.
And that could really be some progress. But one of the challenges is with the way that coal mining is done around the world, there might not be mitigation options for every coal mine.
Right.
And that means we need to talk about phasing down, maybe even phasing out coal mining over a period of time that doesn't absolutely destroy economic production. And we need to start having that conversation a lot more seriously.
Yeah, okay. Good. Thank you very much, both our guests from Zoom, Dorothy and Dan. Give our best to Neil as well. And Chris, thank you very much. Did a great job. And we'll see you later. Thank you.